One other piece of housekeeping. If you're joining us through the WOVA app, so through the conferences application, there are two chat spaces. One is inside the WOVA app and one is inside Zoom. To pose questions today, please try and use the Zoom chat because that's the one that we will all be able to see. For those of you who've just joined through the Zoom link, that's obviously not an issue, but it's just if you're joining through the conference application. All right, we're going to begin in a minute. For those of you who've just arrived, welcome. A reminder that there is French and Spanish interpretation. If you click more at the bottom of your screen, click interpretation and choose the language that you prefer. If you're an English speaker and would not understand French or Spanish questions later on, please remember to select the English channel, and then you'll be able to understand throughout. Even though the session will be held in English, we may receive questions from the floor. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Georgina Kandel-Kemp. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our session today, especially to people who are in my time zone. It's 6 a.m. here, so those of us on this end of the world all have coffee and are doing our best. So I'm based at the International Development Research Center, where I lead an initiative called Step Change, which is dedicated to accelerating equitable and inclusive locally led adaptation. We support 8 projects across that are active in 19 countries across Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And today I'm calling in from Ottawa in Canada, which is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, who've been the stewards of these lands and these waters for time immemorial. I'd like you to take a moment just to think about where you're calling in from. Thinking about the stewards of the lands on which we live is important in the context of conversations about locally led adaptation. I think if we're not careful, we can get caught up in the latest jargon and policy drives and forget that locally led adaptation is not about doing something new. It's about recognizing resilience and adaptation where it's happening and finding ways to ensure that things like adaptation finance reach the people and the places where the hard work is happening and where it has always happened. However, even as we recognize and work to promote local climate action, we do need to pay attention to what is happening at broader scales and the opportunities and the challenges that these changes represent. And this is how we come to the global goal on adaptation, which we're going to be thinking about today in the context of locally led adaptation. So the idea of the global goal on adaptation was enshrined in the Paris Agreement way back in 2015, but it wasn't until COP26 in Glasgow that some steam began to pick up on actually agreeing to a global goal. The Sharm el-Sheikh work program at that time was dedicated to developing the global goal, and finally last year at COP28 a global goal on adaptation was agreed to. The global goal identifies targets to reduce climate risk for key social, economic, and environmental systems, as well as targets intended to track progress across iterative adaptation cycles. And we've now entered into a 2-year period with the Bellum work program where indicators will be identified to make the global goal on adaptation operational. And as we enter into this 2-year period, some deep practical questions need to be answered. For example, how are we going to reconcile the drive for locally led adaptation with the targets identified in the global goal? The timeframes will be difficult to reconcile, as locally led action seldom lends itself to the adaptation cycle currently identified in the global goal. Spatial challenges are also rife because locally relevant indicators often lose meaning as they stretch out to broader scales, especially geographic scales, and are subsumed into national and international stock-taking exercises. And there's an ever-present risk that top-down measures will ultimately be used to assess locally led adaptation, negating the very premise of the whole approach. So these are all questions that I think we'll all be thinking about in the coming years, and they're all questions that we'll be thinking about in some way in this session. So as we face down these questions, it's important to remember that we're not starting from scratch. And that's what the session is really about. Today, you're going to hear 3 case studies from efforts to monitor locally led adaptation in Kenya and Ecuador. These cases give us insight into what's working and what's not working in existing efforts. And so from this grounding in specific context, we'll then move into a panel discussion where we have a speaker who's been deeply involved in the development of the global goal, another who's worked on local metrics for adaptation for many, many years, and another who specializes in the interface between policy and evidence. And I'm going to introduce each speaker as we meet them throughout the session. Together, we're going to be considering the opportunities to influence the global goal and adaptation, methodologies and indicators as they are developed in the coming years, the challenges of scaling up local metrics, and approaches to ensuring that locally led adaptation is indeed reflected ultimately in the global goal and adaptation. We'll then open up to the floor for Q&A. And we're hoping that you'll leave the session with a contextualized understanding of some of the challenges of measuring locally led adaptation, and a generalized insight into the opportunities ahead and why these matter. All right, so without any further ado then, I'm going to welcome our first speaker, Esperanza Carajo. Esperanza, if you could turn on your camera. I can't actually see because I'm sharing my screen with the slides. Esperanza is the Kenya program manager for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, or CDKN. She works with South North, and she's been working on supporting and monitoring the implementation and outcomes of locally led adaptation in Kenya for quite some time now, taking quite a longitudinal approach to how those efforts are being measured. So Esperanza, looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Georgina. Yeah, I think I don't need to go back to my introduction. I'll just go straight to the conversation today. The topic of this talk is basically a reflection of GGA targets through country-driven and participatory processes. And I'll be speaking to lessons from the functionality and governance assessment that happened in Kenya just last year and is just getting completed now, of adaptation investments study in Kenya. These investments were made more than 7-8 years, and some have been around for up to 10 years. So just gonna be talking about the challenges and opportunities to inform the GGA targets through country-driven processes. And yeah, on that deck is just one of the water investments, which is a water kiosk where that makes it easily and accessible, makes water accessibility easier for the communities. Next, Georgina. So another investment of a borehole, a strategic borehole specifically, that is in a northern arid part of Kenya called Wajir. And yeah, it's also one of the investments that were done about 8 years ago. And yeah, I think we can go to the challenges. And yeah, so I just made a summary in relation to some of the information that was coming out strongly in terms of the effectiveness of the LLA adaptation projects. And I just summarized them into 4 points. So in terms of progress, so the first one is on progress reporting. And this particularly is I'd like to mention that when you go out to the counties in Kenya, that's the subnational areas in Kenya, you'll find that there are quite a lot of silo adaptation projects that are led by CSOs. And this has given the government quite a challenge in ensuring they're able to monitor, evaluate, capture the learnings that are coming from these projects, and also just how to report the outputs and the outcomes of these projects in a structured way. And an opportunity that is coming out in ensuring that the progress reporting is structured and would be recommended in communicating and linking to the GGA targets would be ensuring joint work planning for the CSOs with subnational government and national government, because at this level, there are already monitoring and evaluation systems, one at the subnational level that feeds into the national one. That is like in Kenya, particularly the National Integrated Monitoring and Evaluation System. So the joint work, why we looked at the joint work planning process is because it aligns with the government's adaptation opportunities and priorities. And it fosters government ownership to ensure that there's structured progress reporting, there's knowledge transfer among the institutions and organizations that are collaborating and working together. There's also capacity building that is also one of the challenges that I'll talk to, but the joint work planning also ensures that this happens and at different levels, from the community level to the national level, and also ensuring that collaboration actually facilitates the consideration of the diverse perspectives that different partners bring on board. I can go to the next. And then the other point is basically on aligning with existing systems. As I mentioned, Kenya already has MEL systems at both levels, both the subnational and national level. But you find that mostly the data and the knowledge that is generated from the use and the management of locally led adaptation investments is rarely captured, is rarely reported, and it's not sometimes, I think most of the times, not used for MEL purposes. And from that challenge, the opportunity that was coming up is that the MEL systems at the subnational level can be used, at the national level, we can leverage what is already there to report on progress. And I think what came out strongly is that what already exists, the adaptation indicators have not quite well captured, the MEL systems have not quite well captured the adaptation indicators. And specifically, capturing these indicators to be able to generate this information would ensure that there's evidence communicated that captures and integrates the voices of the most marginalized groups. And it also ensures that their views and aspirations are also reflected into these targets, which helps to articulate their adaptation story. And ultimately, I think I would say it's crucial that countries define indicators that align with the risks and the vulnerabilities that are identified in the PCRAs, that is the climate risk assessments, and also the vulnerability and capacity assessments that happen through consultations, and important to actually link these to the tracking of those priorities in their MEL systems. I think I can go to the last deck. Also noted, well, financing is basically a common and mutual issue in most countries. And one of the things that came out is that there is a challenge for finance to build the capacities for the MEL systems. And that's why I was recommending joint work planning and collaborations that will strengthen this. And at that level where we were conducting the assessments, we realized that the subnational governments do not actually have capacity to support investments that are coming from both governments, but also the CSOs. And the issue that came out is that there's just too much going on that is not aligned. And when you consider the capacity that the government has, it becomes more of a load work for them. Also noting that the risk of not actually capturing the knowledge and learning coming from the community for these particular investments is that it limits the conversations that are critical in influencing financial flows for adaptation. Yeah, and that's in terms of opportunity, this one is a little bit tricky. There really requires allocation of finance for months per project. It's still a conversation that is hard to have because we need finance for many other climate actions, but then we still need finance to be able to monitor and ensure progress reporting. And also, I thought that the exploring collaborations with institutions and organizations working with M&E systems would also foster, or rather, it would leverage on the available financing and the capacities resources. Then what also came up is the capacity building for communities. There is definitely a need for this. And as we know, is that adaptation happens at a very local level and it's very contextual. So monitoring the progress of this adaptation therefore requires equipping the communities with the relevant skills to be able to record, document their lived experiences, evaluate the interventions' effectiveness in addressing their vulnerabilities, and also ensuring that gender and social inclusion issues are also captured and strengthening their resilience to guide and inform the GGA process. I think the risk of actually not capturing this knowledge and learning coming from this is that it also limits the conversations that are critical in influencing the financial flows for adaptation. And in terms of opportunity, other about collaborations in development of training materials for the communities, joint work planning again at the inception level of establishing the investments that will most likely leverage on existing knowledge, which is most likely already hosted by the organizations to enhance community capacities and facilitate knowledge exchanges, and also retention to ensure posterity and ease of access in the future. Yeah, I'm gonna end it at there. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Esperanza. That was just, just laid out so fantastically those challenges and opportunities. Great. For those of you who joined after we began, just a note that we're using the chat in the Zoom application. So if you're joining via Wova, please be sure to use the chat. There's sort of two chats there, but please use the one inside Zoom. And Esperanza, if you could just be alert to any questions in the chat. This is for all the speakers really, but since you're the first speaker, and respond to any questions that you would like to in the chat. Any questions that are not answered by speakers in the chat, we'll harvest them and come back to them during the Q&A. So please do feel free to post your questions if you're in the audience in the chat. All right, so next up we have Paula Zavala. Let me see how I'm going to do this. Okay, Paula is the Climate Change Program Director at Fundación Futuro Latinoamericano, or FLA. They're based in Quito, Ecuador. I think that Paula is calling in from Florida this morning. She has a large cup of coffee with her, the same as me and many of us on the side of the world. Welcome, Paula. Thanks for joining so early. Over to you.
Thank you, Georgina. Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to jump right into my presentation so we have a little bit more time for questions and conversation. So today I'm going to share a little bit of some of the reflections on adapting and applying a locally led adaptation scorecard that was an initiative from IIED together with other local Global South organizations to apply a scorecard on how LLA principles are applied throughout the finance delivery chain. So I'll share with you what our findings were and how we went through this scorecard. So you can go to the next one, Georgina, please. And just briefly to give you an idea of who we are a Global South organization based, as Georgina was saying, in Quito, Ecuador. This year we're having our 30th anniversary, and we're an organization that works on sustainable development, but we believe that working through local communities and local organizations is the way to sustainable development. We facilitate dialogues and create those spaces for capacity building throughout these local stakeholders. FLA has also endorsed the LLA principles. And just to give you a fact, this year, over the next years, we're going to place over $1.3 million to local organizations directly to advance locally led initiatives. So we're very committed to doing locally led development. So going on to the next one, Georgina, if you could please go on. So the experience we analyzed was an adaptation fund project that is working in the northern part of Ecuador together with Colombia. So it's a binational program of the Adaptation Fund for $14 million. It has 5 years of implementation. And the project is focused on building the adaptive capacity of to climate change through food security and nutrition systems in Afro and indigenous communities in both countries in the northern border of Ecuador, Colombia and Ecuador. And you can see up in the map where these communities are. And it's very interesting also that one of the indigenous groups shares the border in Ecuador and Colombia, but they're one nationality. So they're one ethnic group. So that was very interesting. Going on to the next one. So what we did, you can move on to the next one, Georgina, please. Thank you. So what we did was various interviews and focus groups. We had the opportunity to talk to over 70 people from the different delivery chains. So that means the local partners at the very local level. So talking to the Indigenous Federation for the Awa people and also the Afro-Ecuadorian Confederation of the Northern Esmeraldas area. So talking to them at the local stakeholder level. The intermediaries was the World Food Program, so we had the opportunity to talk to them, but also some of the local authorities and the national authorities, so the Ministry of Environment and also the provincial government. And we tried to talk to the donor, that was the Adaptation Fund, but unfortunately we didn't have a response, so we couldn't talk to them. So you can see there was a very diverse breadth of stakeholders that we talked to for this purpose. Moving on to the next one, Georgina, please. You can see this is what we did. So this was the methodology that we used. We took the scorecard that was developed by IIED and we adapted. So we went through a whole process of reviewing the scorecard, translating it to Spanish, and really looking at what the initial scorecard was. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that process because I think it was very interesting. We did a whole design of a tool so that we can go out there and talk to these different stakeholders. And then we gathered the information. We looked at the project information, and then went out and did the interviews and the focus groups. And then we did the analysis of what came out of those interviews and focus groups. And we identify certain patterns that were common among the different stakeholders. And then we provided the report, and we had the opportunity to also share out at COP last year some of our findings together with the other organizations that did the same exercise in other countries. So going on to the next one, just a little bit on how we adapted the scorecard. So we had the all the 8 principles, and what we did was analyze what was in this scorecard, and we completely changed it. So we developed a series of questions that were with various criteria that had double entry questions, not necessarily the same equal to the 8 principles, but we developed it, we amplified it a little bit more. And we analyzed which questions were appropriate for each of the different finance delivery chains. So, for example, when we went out to the communities, we had to make it more simple and adapt it to their reality in order for them to respond in a more open way. So we did. You can see the transformation from the original scorecard to what we came up to with in the end. So the next one just gives a little bit of a summary, very brief summary of the different perceptions of applying this scorecard to all the different levels. Overall, I think the example that we saw, this project was a very good example, because you can see that there aren't that many difference of perceptions, except maybe a little bit at the community level, because we went out all the way to the community level, the very local level, and because they didn't have the opportunity to really have a decision making say in terms of the third principle, which is the financing. So overall, you can see that all of these different elements from the principles were not in such a bad shape. So there weren't that many differences of opinion for the principles applied. So moving on to the next one, just a little bit of what we learned here is that when looking into the scorecard, we could see that a lot of the gender equity and social inclusion elements were not incorporated in the scorecard. So we had to try to incorporate that. So promoting that co-creation process with a gender equity and social inclusion perspective from the beginning is really important, so that you don't have to adapt it, throughout, like in the middle or at the end of the project. So having that from the beginning is really key. The other thing is that applying these kind of tools that are self-reflection tools for the donors, and including quantitative and qualitative areas is really important. And it has to include a variety, a diversity of actors. So, and this should be done from all throughout the whole program cycle. So having that self-reflection tool for donors is really important, but also to have those type of tools for local actors to also see what the donors are doing in terms of really applying LLA. So this will allow for real adaptive management throughout the program, so that when you do apply these tools like the scorecard, you can really have adaptive management, so that you have flexibility to really make those changes and really try to address the local level needs that are happening in the project. I also want to agree and emphasize on what Esperanza said before about taking the risk. I think some of the challenges that we saw was that when you talk about LLA, and you have to take that risk, and donors have to take the risk of really trusting the local actors, investing in long-term processes, and building local capacity. So if you wanna do LLA, you really have to take that risk, and that will take some time. So it's important to be conscious of that, to do a real adaptive management throughout the program. And I think I'm going to leave it there, and so we can talk a little bit more about challenges and open it up to the participants. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paula. So just a reminder, anyone who joined a little bit late, please do post questions in the chat. All the speakers will be attentive to the chat, and then we will come back to any unanswered questions during the Q&A portion. We're currently hearing 3 case studies of efforts to monitor locally led adaptation, and then we'll go into a panel discussion reflecting on what this means for the global goal on adaptation and the years ahead. So it's my very great pleasure now to introduce Leah Aoko, who is the project coordinator for a project called Locally Led Adaptation Metrics for Africa, or LLAMA. And Leah's going to share efforts led by the Africa Research and Impact Network over quite some time now to develop locally led metrics. So we've just heard from Esperanza, we heard the challenges and opportunities that she's seen after many years working on LLA in Kenya. From Paula, we heard about an effort with indicators developed from the principles of locally led adaptation, so sort of outside generated indicators but adapted to the local context. And now we're going right down and saying, well, what do bottom-up indicators potentially look like and how are those developed? So Leah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Georgina, and thanks everyone for joining us for our session today. I'll just be briefly reflecting on the locally led adaptation metrics for Africa, a project being implemented by the Africa Research and Impact Network. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a brief sort of introduction is that the LLAMA project, or the locally led adaptation metrics for Africa, is really premised on a few facts: that climate change, one, increases vulnerabilities of various social groups, women, men, persons with disabilities, the youth, and children included. So LLAMA is basically focusing on how we can measure adaptation efforts for smallholder farmers in the Lake region of Kenya, with possible replication in Benin. So adaptation actions that are geared towards building the resilience of these vulnerable communities need to be needs driven. And more often than not, we find that some initiatives or interventions do not align with the priorities of vulnerable groups, social groups of the communities, and hence their efficacy or success rates are questionable. And so there's really need to enhance or to just look into how we can effectively measure adaptation efforts, what indicators we can co-create with community groups to look at how they're effective within their context, and how this can inform adaptation policies, how this can inform adaptation funds that we know is highly required in the global south. And so really the assignment that we are on is on a co-creation journey with the community to have community-led frameworks and indicators, or metrics, if you may. And so we are looking to align locally led adaptation with the priorities of the different social groups, especially the vulnerable and the marginalized. And so we'll get each and every social group that has been listed therein: the women, the children, indigenous groups, persons with disabilities, and other minorities living within the Lake region, which is our local setting in this context. And we'll engage them in co-creating or formulating the indicators that will be crucial in measuring the success rates of adaptation initiatives. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as mentioned, our study area is going to be in the Lake region. And this is really interesting because we've seen the ravaging impact of climate change within the 14 counties around Lake Victoria. And so what we aim to do is to look at how that has impacted livelihoods, how that has impacted socioeconomic status of the vulnerabilities that are living therein, that depend on the ecosystems therein, and hence what adaptation initiatives are being implemented and the efficacies of the same. And in terms of efficacies, we mean what are the indicators of success for each and every social group. And this is important because what success looks like, for example, to a group of women is very different to what it would look like to men, and could be different to what it would look like to persons with disability. So we just really want to consolidate these indicators from a local context to share and upscale from the local level to the county and the national to inform the national adaptation plans. So LAMA is going to be replicated in West Africa, sort of the same methodology that is specifically in Benin. And here we're going to be looking at co-creating again indicators for measuring impacts and adaptive capacities, which are largely lacking in many systems and which are crucial for monitoring and evaluating adaptation actions. Next slide, please. So in terms of our methodological approach, we have had a few exploratory meetings and an inception workshop. We have engaged the county government and the national government, and we've liaised with similar initiatives that are ongoing, and perhaps we are going to show that in the subsequent slides. We are heavily relying on citizen science because we believe that communities are engaged in the adaptation process. They are engaged in the adaptation initiatives, but what we want to see is to design a co-creation lab where we'll be able to evaluate the efficacies of all these initiatives and interventions. Are they needs driven, and are they meeting the needs of the community members? We'll also be using surveys in our locations, both in Kenya and Benin. We'll have a digital platform where we'll sort of profile the developed metrics and data tools that have so far been developed by other organizations to look into adaptation metrics. We will also be looking at having multi-stakeholder forum, which we have already started engaging in at the national and county level. We will have the community field schools and summer academy to sort of facilitate knowledge sharing and learning, as well as capacity strengthening for the various stakeholders involved in the project. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, at the local level, we are working with the Grassroots Impact Center, and this is a community group that will sort of facilitate the co-creation labs that we'll be having with the various vulnerable social groups. We'll also, again, of course, be engaging the policymakers in the Lake region across the 14 counties, and virtually with OJAT, which is the organization that will implementing LAMA in Benin. So in the Lake region, we have engaged the governors. They have a Lake region committee, and so we've engaged the CEO and the governors that are represented there. The picture that you see is for the inception workshop that was held in Kisumu, which is a county in Kenya. So of course, at the national level, we have had bilateral discussions with Treasury, who are implementing the FLOCA program in conjunction with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And so here we are really looking at how FLOCA, which is focused on adaptation funding at the county level, can complement what we are aiming to achieve through the LAMA project, that is co-creation of adaptation metrics and indicators. We have been involved instrumentally in the co-development of the National Adaptation Working Group. This again is being led by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. We've had bilateral meetings with other organizations that are working around adaptation initiatives and metrics, and notably Adaptation Consortia, which have identified some indicators at the county level through their projects. So one of the major outcomes that we've had is huge buy-in, stakeholder buy-in by the various stakeholders or by the various parties that we have engaged so far, from the ministry to the local to the county level. Next slide, please. I'll only mention the international level, which as you can see, we participated in the COP28, just to sort of, again, speak on Llama, have knowledge sharing sessions on the preliminary findings based on our research that we are looking at, the literature review, and engaging other high-level stakeholders such as the UNFCCC, just to join in and to feed into the process that we are developing right now in terms of adaptation metrics. Next slide, please. So I'll just pause here to sort of share some initial and highlight some initial insights for Llama that we have been able to map, to scope out. And one is that adaptation measurement is a critical step in the process of adapting to climate change, because it enables parties, of course, to learn from risks and look at the efficacies of adaptation measures. But these measurements are highly contextual. So when engaging with the policymakers at the local and the county level, they've been able to share that adaptation is highly contextual. And if you're going to develop indicators, we'll need to look at how to harmonize these variables that will be identified and how to look into implementation dynamics. For example, the various social groups, their priorities, how to harmonize the same. Notably, we've also scoped out the International Institute for Environment and Development, which has created the tracking, adaptation, and measurement development, perhaps that is familiar to most of us here. And this was implemented in 5 arid and semi-arid counties in Kenya. The efficacy of the study of the same is not really complete, but this just shows you that there is need for there to be community-based adaptation indicators, right? And that depends on the context, because what might be identified in an arid and semi-arid area will not or might not likely be identified in the lake region. That is our study in this context. But we just pointed this out as sort of a progressive learning point that we can tap into through the Llama process. Another important aspect is that Llama is interrogating existing measurements in terms of, are they inclusive? Can it be upscaled, and can it inform policy processes? Because what we want to infuse is evidence-informed policy making in terms of adaptation funding, adaptation interventions, and then meeting the needs of the various vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. So again, some of the insights that we've looked at is that there are several frameworks that have been used over time to evaluate the success of adaptation efforts. We've managed to scope out about 30, which have several indicators. But one of the cross-cutting opportunities, I might say, is that these frameworks need to be contextual. So they have been developed from a high level, and we're looking at a bottom-up approach when it comes to adaptation measurements and co-creation of indicators. So these measurements face several challenges, including, potential timescales, long timescales over which climate change happens, adaptation responses, which are very diverse, lack of clear metrics, which are trying to look into through the project, a criteria for evaluating adaptation success, which is extremely contextual and really depends on the groups that are involved. There have been needs of co-creation labs, co-creation workshops at the government level, at the climate finance institutions, by the communities that are involved in these interventions, sort of the numerous parties and individuals or groups, as you may, and of vulnerabilities that need to be involved in the measurements for evaluating the success of adaptation. And then I think lastly, there's really need to analyze some of the measurements that are being used in terms of adaptation, to look at their weaknesses and their strengths. And this is what we are doing as part of our scoping review, looking at what are their weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what can Lama tap into. So I think generally what I can say is that we look forward to feeding into or strengthening even the whole discourse of the global goal on adaptation, because remember, it's a global goal, and we're talking about communities around us, where we live, where we come from. So there's really need for this discourse to sort of distill to the local level, to distill to the communities, to distill to the vulnerable groups, so that then they're able to feed into the process. And this then can be upscaled through a bottom-up sort of pattern. And I think that would be critical when you're looking at adaptation indicators. So I think I'd leave it at that, and happy to listen into the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Just give me a moment while I adjust my cockpit here. I feel like I've got too many screens open. Thank you so much. All right, so what we're going to do now, could I ask Chris, Lisa, and Jonas to turn on your screens? We're going to head into the panel discussion portion now. So, I mean, just as we get ourselves ready. Hi, Chris. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Jonas. You know, at the beginning of the session and in the lead up to the session, we said that we wanted to have a conversation about the opportunities and the challenges that the global goal on adaptation presents, particularly in the next 2 years. I think, if I understand, this is where Chris is going to come in to understand what are these opportunities for influencing the ways in which indicators and methodologies are developed. And we said we're not starting from scratch. We've got these experiments happening everywhere about how we measure effectiveness and outcomes of locally led adaptation. And we've just heard 3 different examples. This last one from Aaron, you know, really about co-creating indicators, taking an intersectional approach to understanding the outcomes, and so, you know, avoiding these sort of blanket statements about the outcomes and effectiveness, which is really interesting and challenging. And that's one where, you know, what happens when we take that up into the global scale? Can we continue to capture that kind of diversity and important sort of insight? So let's take it. I'm going to introduce all of you in one go, and then I'm going to pose a few questions that I hope you'll help us sort of start to see what's possible here. So Chris Trizos is the Chief Research Officer in the Climate Risk Lab at the University of Cape Town and the Director of Ascend. Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi,
Jonas Atella is the Executive Director of the African Research and Impact Network. Hi, Jonas. And Lisa is the Director for the Climate and Developed Knowledge Network based at South North in Cape Town. So I'm going to start with you, Chris. So you've been deeply involved in the development of the global goal itself, so that, you know, you have this really deep understanding, I think, of the debates and discussions about how it came about. And I'd like to hear from you, now that we've had this very contextualized understanding of what people are doing on the ground. What's the significance, in your view, of the global goal? And if you could just elucidate for us a little bit, what is the process over the next 2 years, and therefore, what are the opportunities for influencing the kinds of indicators that are developed for that global goal, you know, looking ahead over the next few years?
Sure. Thanks, Georgina. I think in terms of significance, I'd maybe talk about 3 things. The first is, we know the science is clear that to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we have to rapidly reduce emissions from fossil fuels in industry and deforestation especially, and sustain those emissions reductions. And we also have to rapidly increase and scale up adaptation to climate change. And so in the Paris Agreement, everyone talks about the well below 2 degrees limit, best efforts to 1.5, and less about the global goal on adaptation. But that's really the pillar in the Paris Agreement that recognizes that adaptation is a global responsibility, and that in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we have to adapt, we have to do it faster, and we have to do it with due care to local contexts. And I think often because we talk about adaptation as such a local thing, that global responsibility nature of it can sometimes get lost in the conversation, but it really comes to the fore when we talk about responsibilities around adaptation support, things like finance for adaptation, technology transfer, capacity building. I think the other significance of it more recently at COP28, it became a bit more specific compared to the wording in the Paris Agreement when the UAE framework for global resilience was adopted, that for the first time sets out sort of theme or sector-based targets for adaptation, as well as targets for different parts of adaptation cycles. But I think particularly I'd like to focus on the theme and sector one. So that's things like food and agriculture, biodiversity and ecosystems, health. So for example, saying that there should be a significant reduction in climate-related mortality and morbidity by 2030 and beyond. So these are really some ambitious targets, and it'll take a lot of effort to achieve them. I think the next 2 years are critical because at COP28, countries did not agree on how to measure progress against those targets that they set. And so there's a work program between now and COP30 in Brazil that set itself the task of coming up with indicators for measuring progress on those targets, and possibly, which I think would be a good idea, some quantified elements for those targets. So how do we measure them both qualitatively and quantitatively? And especially how do we use existing efforts around adaptation tracking and in other areas such as sustainable development goals tracking to inform progress towards those targets. And I think similar to what we've seen with mitigation, where sort of aspirations have been increasing, they're still not where they need to be to limit global warming to low levels, and action is lagging even further behind. But I would hope and expect that with having clearer articulated targets for adaptation, we can start to say some of the same things, that countries have come together as a global community committed to certain adaptation targets. And if we can track them more robustly, then we can start to talk about, are we collectively going in the right direction, or are we not achieving on our stated ambitions? So I'll end there. Thanks so much for the question.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to come back to you later on this idea, and I'm very interested to hear from the case study presenters earlier as well. I'm thinking about, I think Esperanza spoke to it, and so did Leah. This, how we take local indicators up into national adaptation planning process, and then that jump up into the GGA. And so I was thinking about this as a kind of a staggered process. Jonas, I wonder if I could come to you now. You have been working on thinking about and championing bottom-up metrics for locally led adaptation for quite some time. I often have you in my mind when I start thinking about metrics and the way in which you speak about this. So we heard a concrete example of some of the work that you're leading from Leah through the Llama project, but you also heard examples from other teams that I think you haven't heard before, from FLA, and from CDKN in Ecuador and in Kenya. Could you share some of your thoughts on the challenges that you see on the horizon as we try to reconcile these local measures with this now global monitoring efforts that I think we all understand that we need to be part of?
Thank you so much, Georgina, and I hope you can hear me well. This are very interesting presentations, especially from the case study, the 3 case studies, which kind of reinforces the issues that I think are quite critical with regards to thinking about the local sort of situations vis-a-vis the global goal on adaptation. I would say there are 2 interrelated challenges that I think needs to be given attention as we think about basically how to really make the global goal on adaptation important for building resilience, especially at the local level. And number 1 is ways in which the local experiences are going to fade into the global goal on adaptation as it has been cited. And I say this because there is already a very strong perspective that the locally led adaptation is a vehicle through which the local processes can really be fed into the global goal on adaptation. But again, theoretically, this is true because the principles of locally led adaptation are quite talking very well about the communities. They talk about how communities need to be empowered, how they need to be financed, how they need to be understood. But practically, I think the concept of locally led adaptation itself might need to be rethought because in terms of the way it's being implemented in practice, it's actually not locally led. So if you talk about locally led, what do we mean by locally led? How do you define locally led? And to me, locally led means that the interventions that are being promoted are actually based on the aspirations of these communities. What we have today as locally led adaptation is actually implementing local adaptation action. So there's a difference between locally led and locally implementing the local adaptation measures. So we need to really rethink the concept of locally led adaptation in terms of really, is it really locally led in practice, or it's more of still the top-down sort of technocratic interventions that have been designed and then implemented in the local context. So to me, that is still a problem because then you end up not really capturing what locally led is all about. We end up not having interventions that are informed by the aspirations of these local communities. And I think that the work that LAMA is doing begins to interrogate this question in the sense that if we are talking about adaptation interventions, if we are talking about the global goal on adaptation, if we are talking about adaptation financing, what do we want to finance? And who do we want to finance these interventions for? Where are the aspirations? Where are the indicators? Where are the expectations of these local communities who actually are supposed to be the beneficiary of adaptation action? So the global goal on adaptation has that challenge in the sense that the conceptualization of locally led adaptation in theory is great, but in practice, there are a lot of other questions that need to be answered. We need to move away from a relatively technocratic approaches in which a number of the interventions or adaptation interventions have been pursued in ways that then continues to exclude local communities. So my worry is that even with the global goal on adaptation, because of lack of those particular bottom-up local perspectives in the process, then what we see is that a lot of the local voices are going to be excluded in that. The second challenge, which I want to just outline briefly, relates to the fact that adaptation is relatively social. And there are a lot of expectations, a lot of interest from different groups. It is not like mitigation, which is very straightforward. I mean, it's about reducing greenhouse gas, and you can put the numbers and put the money on it. When you come to adaptation, there are different expectations for different groups of people and at different levels. For community members at the local level, adaptation might be more about their livelihoods, how they eat every day. For the government and national level, adaptation might be about big development projects that basically create opportunities or bring GDP in that sense. And for business people and the private sector, which is actually playing a critical role in financing adaptation at the moment, it's about the profits. So it's whether it's profit from development interventions or from the livelihood related intervention. They want to see results and they want to see the profits coming out. So the big question in that is, and the challenge for the global goal on adaptation is how are we going to reconcile those particular diversity of interest, those particular diversity of expectations with regards to adaptation. And that brings me to the final question, Georgina, that when we talk about global goal and adaptation and the targets and the matrices, the big question is therefore that whose metrics are we talking about? You know, who is going to really be the central voice in the global goal and adaptation, given this particular diversity? And I think that is something that this conversation should be able to begin thinking about in terms of reconciling, so that we are not actually having, you know, targets which are dominated by particular sets of actors who are important. I'm not saying they're not important. They are very important in the adaptation discourse. But most importantly, we need to ensure that the discourse of the local communities are reconciled with the discourse of the other powerful actors in this process. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jonas. You brought us right into the uncomfortable space that I think we did want to reach in this session. Thanks very much for that. And later on, Paula, during the Q&A, I'm hoping that you might come back in, because I think what Jonas has said, it sort of challenges the approach around an LLA scorecard, for example, these outside measures of a definition of locally led adaptation enshrined in a set of principles that are then used as indicators. I had a really interesting conversation with one of your colleagues at FLY about that discomfort, and I think Jonas is sort of revealing that. So let's come back to that later if we can. For now, though, I'd like to turn to Lisa. You know, Lisa, CDKN is always attentive to policy entry points and connecting evidence to policy and action. Given the sort of wealth of experience of local level monitoring and LLA, I mean, 2 of the cases today have come out of CDKN, and now this global demand for this kind of data, and I think we're going to see an increasing demand for this in the next two years, if I'm understanding correctly. I was wondering if you could share how CDKN is thinking about engaging and bridging locally led adaptation and the global goal in the years to come.
Thanks, Georgina, and thank you very much for convening this, helping us to convene this very important discussion. I think that, you know, CDKN seeing a couple of opportunities in bridging the gaps, and it's been incredible listening today to all the work being done and how far we're getting in terms of better understanding locally led adaptation and the monitoring of it. I think that the first opportunity really is around creating more space for local evidence that can enhance and embellish on the core indicators of adaptation progress that parties may agree through the indicator work program on the global goal and adaptation, so that, you know, we really need to be bringing in perspectives of how local people are defining and measuring adaptation progress and all the rich evidence that's been shared here today. And I think opening the space for that sort of more qualitative evidence does allow for us to open up the space for the diversity of perspectives. And we need quantitative indicators. We totally do. And just to, you know, to stand by what Chris was saying in terms of ensuring that we do have a sense of everyone, you know, a sense of yardsticks so that we can measure progress. But being able to surface the diversity of local perspectives and local evidence into that framework is going to be really, really important through a qualitative means as well. And then it might not be necessarily, I'm speaking just in the work program for the global goal and the indicators, it might not be developing community-specific indicators, but rather really embellishing the existing ones with local evidence and bringing in the more bottom-up perspectives to give a rounded perspective. And I guess an example here would be, we did the Stories of Resilience publication with the Global Center on Adaptation, where we did a call for stories from across the world and asked local LLA practitioners to share what they were doing on the ground, and we got an incredible over 200 stories. And really, what that showed was that, yeah, people are getting on with doing adaptation and leading interventions, and that we're defining adaptation too narrowly, and we need to widen our definition and include aspects such as spiritual well-being and cultural heritage and sense of place and in community and intangibles that you can often not measure. And this more holistic approach is often what gets lost in the mel of LLA. And because, everyone's been talking about how adaptation is so context specific, it really is through creating space in the framework for these perspectives to emerge is going to be really important. And I mean, as Joannis really rightly pointed out, it's also about the next 2 years and how that work program is approached. Like how can we actually bring community perspectives and into the thinking and into the work there. And there's no silver bullet, but I think we really need to be grappling with that the process of the work program also has to somehow engage with different alternative perspectives from the ground. And I think what also has to happen is we have to really try, there's an opportunity to widen what we understand counts as evidence. And there's, I think the evidence community is thinking more and more about like different storytelling, arts-based evidence approaches. There's incredible variety of adaptation evidence emerging, led by local adaptation practitioners, a lot of particularly young people who are, experimenting with TikTok videos and the like. It's really about being able to bring that into these global assessments in terms of how we can start to bridge the gap. But then, of course, the national level is really key. I'm sort of drawing from today is that, yes, we can look at bridging the gap between the local and the global, but there's a lot about bridging the gaps between national frameworks and local evidence, and how the bottom-up evidence can feed into national MEL systems. And I think that's really, where a lot of the learning can happen. There's so much rich learning that's been shared here today. And how we can also, this sort of Esperanza spoke about collective work programming between CSOs and government, and those sorts of initiatives are real opportunities for how the MEL approach can be a long-term learning process around adaptation over time that really involves communities and diverse social groups. The other opportunity that we're really seeing is that the framework, the global goal, can also help to contribute to norm shifts and new standards around how we do equitable and gender and socially inclusive adaptation. And it can really guide and strengthen our work as actors. And for example, CDKN, the program like CDKN, it can really help us to pull in a particular direction, and we can leverage the targets and the frameworks in our own program. And this can also be leveraged by local actors if they wished. And I think that is, making best use of that as an adaptation community is going to be important going forward, so that we can really leverage it. And for example, we can look at, more equitable MEL of adaptation in terms of embracing better gender, age and disability, disaggregated monitoring, which even if it is voluntary, it can start to help a norm shift at different stages. And what has struck me when looking at, if there's so much, the basis is there. It's really providing quite a solid foundation. There's a lot of mention of country-driven, gender responsive, participatory approaches, human rights-based approaches, social justice, intergenerational equity. I mean, all the importance of local Indigenous knowledge. And I think it's going to be very important as we go forward into the work program on indicators to keep that alive. And I think as an adaptation community, we need to be participating together to make sure that's kept alive as we go forward. And I think I'll just leave it with those two big opportunities.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lisa. Just to underscore one of those points that you made there, which I think forces us to think about it a bit differently. I've been asking, how can we inform the global goal on adaptation? And you turned it around and said, well, the global goal on adaptation can also inform how we prioritize work as well. That's a really interesting and different point from what we've heard from others. So now to all the panelists, to all three of you, but also Paula, Leah, Esperanza, if you want to come in, just raise your hands. Having listened to one another, I'm interested in where you see opportunities for collaboration or areas really requiring significant attention in the years ahead. And if any of you have a thought on whether the global goal on adaptation is even where we should be focusing our attention, let's have a critical conversation about this. Is this a red herring or not? For those of us, because there is a tension in the sense that we're seeing growing momentum around locally led adaptation at the same moment that a global goal adaptation is finally agreed, and it's really important. And so we have these kind of potential for the two solitudes, and this conversations about potentially how we bring them together. I hope I can see you. So just raise your hands or just unmute. Might be the easiest. It's an invitation to any of you to come back in now and reflect on where you see opportunities for collaboration or areas requiring additional work. I'll pick on you, Chris. I can just see you sitting there.
Sure. I think we need to move forward with both simultaneously. I don't think the global goal on adaptation is a red herring to the extent that it helps with resource provisioning by setting a clear target. And a lot of what constrains adaptation at the local scale, especially in developing country context, is the resources. And so that the multilateral system, it's not going to solve every adaptation challenge clearly, but one thing it is good at is setting ambition and setting a direction of travel, even if it's often slow to deliver on that. And so I think it's really about trying to find the places where these two agendas connect. Because I think they are connected. I think one thing I didn't get to when I spoke earlier is there's a real richness in learning about the complexity of adaptation and adaptation tracking at the local level. But I think the community has to get to a place where it can articulate that clearly, but not as a barrier to having targets in a global goal. Because that can be a bit of a double-edged sword, right? People can say, well, adaptation is so complex, it's so context dependent. We can't have these global targets or global goals. Whereas I think some of the global targets that were agreed at COP28 were quite careful to say, we would like to have less people dying because of climate change, but we're not prescribing how any local context has to achieve that. And so it recognizes that, right, that's up to local context often. But at the same time, I think often that gets a bit confused, that there's sort of this tension that like adaptation's so local, we can't have these global processes. And then people use that to fight back and say, well, then we can't fund adaptation because we can't track adaptation. And I think we've got to nip that conversation in the bud and just be like, we know it needs a lot more funding. We know it needs a lot more support. Surely we can all agree that we want fewer people in the future to be ill or dying because of climate change, but how that pans out in every local context, of course, is probably a bit different. So I think I'll end it there, but that's how I see the connection.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Would anyone else like to come in from the panel? And just to say to the audience, Paula, I see that you've unmuted, so you're up next. Just to the audience, we are shortly going to open up for Q&A. If you'd like to put a question in the chat, please do so now. But I'll also invite you to unmute if you prefer to voice a question. So Paula, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been very interesting to hear all the different cases and perspectives. And I see a great opportunity for using spaces like this to collaborate and to see how we can help that real LLA be implemented. I mean, I see, and I totally agree with Dr. Jones about the challenges on how we're looking at LLA and what we're, we have to compete and keep up with that global adaptation goal. But at the same time, we need to make changes on how we see LLA being implemented at the local level. So I really believe in co-creation processes, and this has to be done from the beginning. So it's not just going to a community and consulting or informing them on what's going to happen, but really co-creating this with local stakeholders. And in that sense, there's a whole, and I think some of my colleagues here said about taking that risk, right? So it involves maybe losing resources, taking additional time, because it has to be a long-term process. So it can't be, the way projects are being set up sometimes for 3 years, 2 years. I mean, what can really happen in such a short time period? You have to think about long-term processes and really investing in local stakeholders and respecting and going with that local processes, those governance platforms that are happening already on the ground, and really getting into that local perspective. So I think there's a huge challenge, because we do need the metrics, and we all understand that, and we all want to come up with having some results. And many of these local initiatives have to also feed into the national goals, and those national goals have to go to the international commitments. But we have to start thinking differently and moving in a different direction, and having the civil society organizations like the Global South organizations be part of this, the scorecard. This scorecard, and I know it was a huge effort done, but it was done from a top-down approach. When we looked at this, we really dove into the scorecard and said, this was developed by someone who doesn't really know what's going on the ground. So that's why we made such huge modifications, because I think we're a little bit closer to those local stakeholders and understand a little bit more the reality. And I think that's what's happening, between all of these different organizations that are sharing with me the panel today, that we're seeing all these big differences. So I think we can work together and try to make this a more integrated approach, a more holistic approach of how we're doing LLA. And we need to bring that voice up to the donors and to who's financing these initiatives. So yeah.
Thanks, Paula. All right, I'm going to invite the audience to start raising your hand if you would like to voice a question. Still an open invitation to any of the speakers who want to react to anything that you've heard. My view of the chat, is not very, very clear, but I do see, Lisa, there's a comment here from Jamie Williams. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at that. They say transferring locally created indicators into global indicators is not possible or desirable. Useful global indicator could be on process, i.e. extent to which adaptation interventions are adopted, participatory impact monitoring and evaluation, or intention, the extent to which interventions realize the principles of LLA. I think that's very much the scorecard approach that Paula shared. It's quite a long comment. I might not go through all of it, but I like the sort of challenge right at the end. Otherwise, LLA, newly recognized in decision 7, etc., will be left behind because it can't be measured by global aggregation. And I think this is a danger, right? And I think that's what Chris was telling us. If we can't do this, then we can't be recognized. If we're not recognized, you can't get financed. So let's put our heads around this. Lisa, come back.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let me respond to that. I think that absolutely I agree. And we can't transfer community-driven indicators into a global framework. And I don't think I agree that it's not possible. And in looking at the the current framework, there are these process indicators. And for me, I saw that that was the biggest opportunity potentially to start to think about how to build in LLA approaches into that iterative adaptation planning cycle, which is, I think, exactly what you've mentioned here, Jamie, about focusing on process. Because adaptation, locally led adaptation is a process. It's more the how of how we do adaptation and how we do it more equitably, and how we enable local leadership and agency in adaptation. So I do think that, yeah, in the framework, that is the biggest potential opportunity. And I think that that's yeah, so just in response that I agree. And I definitely wasn't saying that I think we need to bring community relevant indicators into the global framework, but rather to provide space for qualitative evidence and more bottom-up evidence of adaptation into how we track progress on adaptation effectiveness. I hope that answers
Great.
the question.
Yeah,
Could
great.
I come in with a quick comment on that as well?
Please do. Yeah.
I think I agree that sort of transferring a locally created indicator to a global indicator might not be possible, but I don't think that means aggregation and other forms of, aggregation broadly is something that's undesirable or not possible. So if we go back to the health context, things like number of people at risk per 100,000 or caseloads from an infectious disease that's climate sensitive, such as dengue, or outcome-based things like vaccine coverage, are metrics that work both very locally, very regionally, very globally. And I think the danger of focusing only on process is often, when you get to aspects of support, process can be very cheap. And so it can undermine certain developing country narratives of the scale of support that's needed for adaptation, right? Like and we saw some of this with COVID, like having a vaccination plan, having a purchase agreement, having certain discussions around equitable distributions are all necessary, but insufficient in terms of resourcing to actually get global vaccine coverage. You might say the same about infrastructure, climate proofing infrastructure, right? Having infrastructure plans and processes as the adaptation cycle is described in the global goal on adaptation, I think is dangerously alluring to say, okay, that's the place locally led adaptation sits only, because you can get stuck in the bit of a rut we've been in for a while around support for planning, which we absolutely does need to happen and be increased, but it can distract from the implementation and the outcomes-based part. And I think, yeah, we need to keep a focus on both. So I don't think we should say locally led adaptation belongs here in process rather than in outcome. I think it's thinking creatively about what can it also contribute to the outcome in terms of being able to continue the pressure and the evidence for the large increase in support needed for adaptation action around the world. Thanks.
If I can say this,
please, Jonas. Yeah.
Yeah. No, a quick one. I mean, I like the comments, especially from Tiros. Very, very interesting. But I guess I also want to raise the point that we are not in the adaptation discussion simply because we want to align to the most important processes. But the adaptation discussion is because we want to reduce vulnerabilities. That's basically the end game. And if we can't achieve that in whichever way, then I think then we are all failing in terms of what we need to push for. I think fundamentally, the adaptation community must rethink their approach to engaging in the discourses, and the reason why for many years, that consolidation and having having the power to be able to push the systems, because I think that's what we really need, to push the systems to be able to really listen to what is important. but not to massage the systems and allow the sort of inequalities, the sort of vulnerabilities that still exist at community level to persist. We need to organize ourselves as adaptation community and think about how we want to pursue a narrative that really strengthens the discourse of adaptation, especially for the local people in the decisions that are being made. I think that is a challenge, because I think in most situations, especially the COP, if you look at the COP 28, what we see is that the discussions on climate actions are actually shifting a lot from basically, vulnerability-based discussions to more investment-based discussion. And that is happening because the adaptation community has not been able to convince the decision processes that there is really a reason to give attention to adaptation in terms of financing, in terms of putting clear decisions in that process. Even the negotiation on the global goal on adaptation, it was a lot of push and pull in COP28. And so many people or so many negotiators are not actually seeing the need for having some of those targets. It's simply because the adaptation community hasn't been able to consolidate their thoughts and be able to have a conversation that really can help to push the systems for the benefits of the local communities. And just to highlight again, we need these kinds of conversation, Georgina, because if we are not going to share and come together and be able to speak in one voice, if we are not going to avoid the many scattered side events that we have in the COPs and everybody chasing their small little thing, we are not going really to change the discourse. If we can think about creating collaborations, creating platforms that can really aggregate evidence, can aggregate the voices, can aggregate the advocacy in ways that can then approach the international decision-making processes with regards to adaptation, whether it's in terms of financing, whether in terms of technologies, but in a consolidated and aggregated way. I think that is what the adaptation community might want to start thinking about in order to move the process. Otherwise, I also want to agree with Chris. We will be in the same cycle of complaining and raising this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. I'm going to treat that as the mic drop for the end of the conversation. That was a great intervention. We've got two minutes left. I think just to say to the speakers, this has been a fantastic first conversation. This is the first time we've come together, projects across Step Change, to have a really meaningful conversation. So those on the line, everyone who's been speaking today is supported through the Step Change initiative and different projects. I've put a link in the chat. You can explore their projects, find the links to their projects, and it is just the start of the conversation. And I think it's really good timing that we've all come together right at the beginning of the Bellum Work Program, thinking about indicators for the global goal and this important work that everyone's doing around locally led adaptation. I see Paula is giving you high fives in the chat, Jonas. I agree. We're out of time. Thank you so much. I feel very privileged to have you all in my orbit and to be part of this program with you all. Thanks so much. I'd like to say thank you to ICAD, if I may. ICAD provided simultaneous translation in both Spanish and French for us. Thank you to the interpreters and to ICAD for organizing that, and the entire Gobeshona Conference, which has been fantastic. I've learned a lot over the last more than a week. ICAD has asked me to remind you that the final closing ceremony is happening now in just a few minutes. So please, would anyone who would like to attend that just go over to that event. And they also asked that we turn on our cameras for a photo. I'd have to ask someone from ICAD to just come online and tell us. I don't know how to put us into gallery. I don't know how that works, but and I assume it's everyone's invited, maybe all the audience as well. If you're still on the line, turn on your cameras. We have a group photo. I don't think it's just for the speakers. But otherwise, if you need to leave, thank you so much for joining us. Is Fatine or Joel here to take the photo? I hope I wasn't meant to take the photo because I don't know how to do that. I believe they might have left. So if anyone else knows how to take a photo on Zoom, you can come in and save me. Oh, there you go.
I did
Okay.
it. I'm sorry.
Okay. Fatine's lost her voice from a whole week of conferencing. Sorry, Fatine, to make you talk. Okay, go ahead. Let us know with a thumbs up once you've taken it, so you don't have to speak again. It's done. Okay, everyone is free. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you all soon in some other venue.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Bye-bye.